Hey everyone, Shannon Scott with Bonaventure Cemetery Journey. Shannon Scott Tours, and of course your TAFO file with the most out here in pre-spring Bonaventure Cemetery. Although by the looks of these azaleas, you wouldn't know it. Feels very much like spring. But within the 204 acres, there are 27 miles of azaleas. It's amazing. But one that always blooms early and very grandly is that of this shrub. It's almost like what do you want to call it? The primary that kicks off the world's quietest fireworks show. And it sits next to the grave of the great Southern novelist, playwright, screenwriter Harry Hervey, who is buried here with his mother, Jane Davis Hervey. And in 1939, he published the novel The Damned Don't Cry, which is an illustrious book, essentially about a murder and murder trial in Savannah, Georgia. And I think it's really appropriate that the shrub is so flamboyant because he too was a very flamboyant dresser and dressed kind of like Lord Byron in his Albanian sort of fetish. He dressed in Far East and Middle Eastern kind of cultural clothing, and even in Savannah, Georgia in the 1930s and 40s, which must have been something to see. But ultimately, Hervey died a young man at 50 years of age in 1951, suffering with throat cancer. In fact, as a storyteller, they had to remove his larynx, which must have just been absolutely abysmal for a storyteller. He's also interestingly buried near the Scottish cairn, that stone domicile, which not only was a headstone of antiquity, and it's related to another family grave, but I just think the proximity is interesting. But in the old days, the ancient times, family would have gathered around such an object and built fires and told stories around the ancestors' graves. So it just seems kind of fitting that Herbie is buried near such an object. But I always like to kind of ritualize my storytelling year with a little kind of story shamanism. And what I mean by that is that Harry Hervey wrote, in my opinion, some of the most illustrious lines ever spoken about Bonaventure Cemetery in The Damned Don't Cry. And his main character, Zelda O'Brien, as a young woman, comes to Bonaventure to meet, in her mind, let's say, her soulmate or her betrothed to be, which, if I recall correctly, doesn't go exactly as planned, but she was just a young woman at the time. And so, if you'll indulge me, this is kind of my annual reciting of that passage, and we'll see what you think. When they reached Bonaventure, it lay drowsing in the mild April sunlight. As they entered, a flight of butterflies made sparse confetti. A pale shell road melted into a vista of pontifical splendor. The green of the live oaks and magnolias, the hoary smoke of the moss, the graying blandness of obelisks, slabs, and shafts all blended into somber Gothic above the votive fires of the azaleas. Row upon row of them pile along the lanes, magenta, cerise, salmon, pink, and white, ragged, exultant hedges flaunting their carnal vividness in the celibate glooms, their prolificy gloriously obscene. They mocked the graves and made void the dreary prophecies of vaults and tombs. They were eternal flowering out of the groin of the earth. They were flames out of skulls. Zelda felt awed by this pagan exaltation in the midst of orthodox seclusion. And wow, such powerful, powerful words from the writer Harry Hervey. We'll kind of close in on his grave here. As he lay dying, he actually took a moment to write his own inscription, his own epitaph, let's say in the month of August, perhaps 1951. And I always say to my guests, if you're not moved by these words, well, you may not be human. Mine has been a long journey to the uttermost hinterlands, and my eyes and my heart are filled with what I have seen. One cannot have looked behind the mask we have put upon death, and found there the face of God, without being invested with the highest inspiration, the deepest humility. And I think there was a man who appreciated the smallest and the largest things in life, and really packed a lot in for 50 years, a short life. 12 novels, dozen travel journals, all kinds of Hollywood films and plays. In fact, love it or hate it, Pulp Fiction, the movie, Black Mass Magazine that inspired the movie Pulp Fiction, they declared Hervey some time ago one of the greatest pulp fiction writers of the 20th century. So yeah, he did a lot in those 50 years, and it's always an inspiration to share bits of his life with people, especially those passages about Bonaventure. So thanks for watching, everyone. Happy spring.